The dishes were still in the sink from breakfast. It was the first sight that greeted Sandra Gillibrand as she walked into the kitchen after being at work for 12 hours. She'd just completed a double shift at the diner. She was glad for the work because they needed the money, but her feet were killing her, her back was aching, and she wanted nothing more than to crawl into her bed and just declare that today was officially over. "Mom?" Sandra took a breath and turned around, her smile in place. "Hey, honey, did you get everything out of the car?" Her son Luke nodded, his big brown eyes staring out at her from under a mop of light brown hair. "Can I go see if Sammy is here?" Sandra hoped the disappointment wasn't on her face at the mention of Luke's imaginary friend. At age 10, he was too old for them. But Luke had hit all his milestones at later dates than most kids, so being that friends were one area where Luke really struggled, she supposed she should be happy that he was at least role-playing how to be a friend. And she hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would help with making real friends. Luke had been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome 2 years ago. While having the diagnosis at least helped Sandra to have a better idea of what to expect, it hadn't made Luke's life any easier. The kids at school still gave him a hard time. He just couldn't read people. He assumed everyone was a friend. As a little boy, his open embrace of the world had made her heart sing. As he'd gotten older, it terrified her. Now he stood looking at her expectantly, framed in the doorway of the old kitchen. The notches from his growth chart were lined up next to him. When had he gotten so big? "Please, Mom." She stood, indecisive. She didn't like him going out to the old barn. Their house sat next to the O'Hare farm, a giant, sprawling 200-acre working farm. Corn was their major crop. Sandra and Luke's house had been on the farm that O'Hare had bought the land from decades ago. Now all that was left of that past was the barn and the house. Out the window, the shadows were already beginning to form. While she did not like him being out there, he'd had a rough day. Some kids had teased him at lunch, and the teacher had called Sandra at work to let her know. She assured Sandra that Luke was fine and the kids were punished. But the idea of her son being the target of bullies just broke her heart. She'd felt helpless all day, with an ache in her chest. But Luke had looked no worse for wear when she'd picked him up at school. He'd sat in a booth at the diner and done his homework and then worked on his computer, coding something or other until the end of Sandra's shift. While she felt like she'd been run over a few times, his eyes were bright at the thought of playing with Sammy. She sighed. Maybe I need an imaginary friend. "Sure, honey, go ahead. Just come in when it's dark, okay?" He gave her a quick smile and then turned for the back door. But then he ran back to her, giving her a hug. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she rested her head on his for a moment. "Thanks, Mom!" Luke sprinted back for the door. The hugs were new, too. He'd overheard her talking to a friend late one night about how she would give anything for him to hug her more, and he'd taken it on as his mission to make sure he did. And today, those hugs helped push away the anxiety that always seemed to be gnawing at her.